It's a reminder from one of the ancient Upanishads. Who am I? Whence is this widespread cosmic flux? These the wise should inquire into diligently, soon, may now. Always a call to really question again and again, who am I and why am I here? This has been at the root of all spiritual teachings, naturally expressed differently in different places, different phraseology. But then one of the things today I just slightly want to spend a few minutes on, I have not said very much about it so far, about what is the understanding of reincarnation is Buddhism, is a little different from what it is in Hinduism. Although extremely similar. In fact, whenever any Buddhist scholar writes anything about reincarnation, they almost always begin with some quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, which is, as I have already said, is the locus classicus of the whole idea of reincarnation. But generally speaking, in the Buddhist tradition, very strong emphasis that there is no permanent self. And that idea, personally in my judgment, at a low level is misunderstood. It is really more to say that there is no one steady self, that there is a great variation. The kind of thing, for example, the British philosopher Hume spent a lot of time discussing exactly this notion. Or in the Gurdjieff teaching it gets said, we have many eyes, not a single eye. That's another way of saying this, that from the morning to the evening, I may deny something in the morning, but very eager to get hold of it in the evening. Something in me is changing. So there is nothing like a permanent I. That is really the root of the idea, but it gets expressed that there is no self. But generally, proceeding with that notion, in the Christian as well as in the Hindu tradition, there is the notion that each one of us has a particular energy, a spiritual energy, which does not die when the body dies. In the Buddhist tradition, what has become a consequence of this notion, that it is not the continuation of the same energy, but it's a kind of a continuation of the same momentum. Like if you light a candle from another candle, it's not the same flame, but the second flame cannot come without the first flame. You see the point I'm trying to make? And similarly, let us say if we have two balls, one ball comes and hits this one, then this ball moves. It cannot move without being hit by the first ball, so it's not moving on its own. So if you don't mind giving a little bit of a physics kind of idea here, from putting it in a physics terminology, in Christianity and Hinduism, it's really the continuation of the same energy. In Buddhism, it's the continuation of the same momentum, not the same energy. And one of the major contributions of Einstein's theory of relativity, starting in 1905, was that neither energy nor momentum have their independence from each other. They are intimately connected with each other. So I mention this simply to point out from a physics point of view, one person is getting too attached to one part of it, the other is getting too attached to the other part of it, but neither one of them is right from a physics point of view. But the expressions are required. That's the reason I'm specially mentioning to you that in the general expressions of Buddhist literature, you would find there is no permanent self. There's very strong emphasis on this. But personally, from my point of view, this is a slight misunderstanding of the basic idea what the Buddha brought, that there is not a steady self which remains the same each time. That constantly that self is varying in its expression or its manifestation. But then another thing that I want to mention, Tibetan Book of the Dead, very famous text, has very elaborate description of what happens after death. In fact, the textbook that I have recommended from Annie Besant death and after is really putting it in English language more or less what has been classically said in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that is also a fairly common idea in the general Indian traditions, but not expressed as precisely as it gets expressed in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So if you wanted to really go through the various details there, that's where you need to read, or just read any Besant's book. The suggestion that soon after death we go through many phases, in Tibetan it's called bardo, a gap. So different stages or different things. And then one looks at one's whole previous life. Now the question always is, generally in the Hindu Buddhist tradition it gets said that oneself looks at one's previous life. Whereas in the Christian tradition it is more or less like St. Peter looks at your previous life and then decides what should happen to you. So in a way it's good to realize that similar notions get expressed slightly differently, and once it gets expressed by somebody, then the whole damn tradition gets attached to that idea. It just cannot be different, you know. So how is St. Peter going to judge you? Yeah. Rather than that you yourself make a decision of what you've done. You look at it carefully, clearly, and you're not, as it were, deciding it, but you really see what action leads to what consequences. So you're basically just looking at the reality of the situation. So here I don't want to go any more details on this, but there is some slight difference in the way the whole notion of reincarnation gets expressed in the Buddhist tradition and in the Hindu tradition. Not very large differences, but then I want to focus a little bit on just to first of all to remind you that this idea of reincarnation is not uniquely only in the Hindu tradition. Now just quickly to look at it, reincarnation is a religious or philosophical concept that the soul or spirit after biological death begins a new life in a new body. That may be human, animal, or spiritual, depending on the moral quality of the previous life's actions. This doctrine is a central tenet of the Indian religions. It is also a common belief of other religions, such as Druidism, Spiritism. Theosophy has now been called a religion. Can you believe this? If you look at it. So, and Ekankar, and is found in many tribal societies around the world, in places such as Siberia, West Africa, North America, and Australia. So it's not unique only to the Indian tradition. And the process of reincarnation from death to new life is expressed in great detail in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Death occurs after the last breath has been taken. Then the individual is in an intermediate state between their previous life and their new life. This state, known as the bardo or gap or interval, can last up to 49 days. According to the Tibetan teachings, there are 3 death bardos: the painful bardo of dying, the luminous bardo of dharmata, which more or less means meditation or reflection. You sort of look at your life, the whole previous life. And the karmic bardo of becoming, depending on the quality of one's life before death. So these are the 3 phases basically. Then in the 1980s, this gentleman called Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life, which created a whole, really practically a little bit of a revolution about the understanding about what happened after death in the scientific realm. And so this is his remark. After talking with over 1,000 people who have had these experiences, he's talking about experiences in which somebody has suddenly died or has been killed, and officially from a medical point of view they are dead, but they still come back alive. And during that time they seem to obviously have consciousness. They can even sometimes say what the doctor said to the other doctor or to the nurse or whatever. So so Raymond Moody was very struck by all this. Then he finally decided to write about it. This is what he writes in his book called Life After Life. It was a great revolution actually in the scientific world. After talking with over 1,000 people who have had these experiences and having experienced many times some of the really baffling and unusual features of these experiences, it has given me great confidence that there is a life after death. See, otherwise, purely from even now in the usual notion of modern medicine, there is no sense that there is anything survives after the body, which is the reason they want to keep the body going on more and more, essentially really extending death. And strong tendency to say, if you take certain kind of medicine, or we will find some more chemicals which will bring your dead body alive again. So keep your dead body preserved, etc. I'm sure you know all this. There is a very large kind of industry behind this to keep your body preserved. Because maybe in 20 years or 50 years they'll find enough scientific or technological information to bring it back alive.
Cryogenics. Cryogenics.
Yes. So then he says, I have absolutely no doubt on the basis of what my patients have told me that they did get a glimpse of the beyond. So Raymond Moody's book really, as I said, in the scientific circles created quite a drama, quite a revolution as well. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, are triggered during singular life-threatening episodes when the body is injured by blunt trauma, a heart attack, asphyxia shock, and so on. About 1 in 10 patients with cardiac arrest in a hospital setting undergo such an episode. 1 in 10 patients. Thousands of survivors of these harrowing touch-and-go situations tell of leaving their damaged bodies behind and encountering a realm beyond everyday existence. Unconstrained by the usual boundaries of space and time, these powerful mystical experiences can lead to permanent transformation of their lives. I personally have not had any such experience. If anybody here has had it, do please speak up. You've had that?
Well, no, I've been a theosophist coming here for 30 years, so I'm kind of familiar with these concepts. But last December, I had radical neck surgery and cut my carotid artery. Took out part of my tongue. And apparently, there was some passage there. But now that I'm on the other side of the story, I have an experiential relationship with this dialogue.
Yes.
And I'm happy to leave the container. And I'm not looking forward to preserving this container in any way, so hence no radiation or chemo. Let it have its way, and I get to leave.
Yes, that's one of the things. Well, I'll speak about this a little bit. It's another thing that in a certain way, people who experience these also become a little free of their attachment to the body. And you're really expressing that very idea here. Yes.
When my father was passing, I sat with him, and at one point he said, I'm not dead, it's only a movie.
Yes.
Which was very telling.
Yeah, actually I will a little bit speak about that as well. These are experiences in which officially a person has been declared dead. But more and more data is now also gathered about what they now call nearing death, rather than, that just became a label, near-death experiences, but that is really speaking about when a person is officially dead. But the other set of experiences nearing death, and people in the hospices, which people are basically there because they are no longer being given medicine, but they are being given enough sort of medicine, if you like, to keep them a little bit pain-free. That's the basic idea. So they're in the hospice, but not being cured from a medical point of view. So that's a slightly different category of experiences.
have another category too, if you want to hear it.
Yes?
I was working with this woman who was trained with the kahunas, and she had put all these crystals on my body, and I left my body, and it felt like I became the eternal flame, and I didn't want to come back. And on the entry back, it feels like it's like you were in a straitjacket, and your belief structures and everything put you back in your body. It's like a physical. Well, your body itself is physical, which creates constraint, but then belief structures are like those corsets the women have. They tie you up and squeeze you, and they lock you in. And it's like, it's, I didn't really want to come back. I mean,
But I'm glad you're back.
Thank you. Well, that makes
Yeah,
me
we
feel
are, David.
good.
We're glad you're back.
Even if you feel bound.
Yeah.
Now, Scientific American article, so clearly the scientists are becoming more and more interested in this. Here I have given the reference for that. It's in June 1, 2020, not that long ago. Near-death experiences are triggered during singular life-threatening episodes when the body is injured by a heart attack, shock, or blunt trauma, such as an explosion or a fall. These events share broad commonalities: becoming pain-free, seeing a bright light at the end of a tunnel, or detaching from one's body and floating above it, and even flying off into space. Why the mind should experience the struggle to sustain its operations in the face of a loss of blood flow and oxygen as positive and blissful rather than as panic-inducing remains a mystery. There are really, in a way, most of the true scientific work comes about because there are mysteries which we don't know why they work, so one is trying to figure them out. That's what becomes the scientific research. I especially recommend this to you people. If you wish, I have given here the reference here. Peter Fenwick, a British, I used to pronounce this as Fenwick, but apparently in England they pronounce it as Fenwick. So I was periodically corrected because he's a good friend of mine. Actually, I've stayed with him. And this particular YouTube talk of his, especially the first about 43 minutes, I highly recommend. Also recommended to download a PDF by Sue Brayan and Dr. Peter Fenwick on Nearing the End of Life, a guide for relatives and friends of the dying. If you have some older people, or sometimes young ones die too, but older ones are expected to die, so you may be interested in this. Here is a remark of a Nobel Prize winner, Sir John Eccles. I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as a superstition. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. As you know, in the previous 2 or 3 occasions now, I have been repeatedly saying, from the spiritual point of view, it's a particle of a divinity, we may call it soul or particle of the spirit, which takes on the body. So it's not that the body has the soul, it's the soul that has the body. Why? Because it wants the body to undertake some appropriate actions in order to assist the evolution of the soul so that it can come back home. back to God. That's from a spiritual perspective, that is the overall perspective. And this is, John Eccles is not exactly saying that, but he's saying at least we should not demean that whole idea here very much. Peter Fenwick, president of the Scientific and Medical Network, in the foreword to the report of the Galileo Commission. I may have already mentioned to you about this Galileo Commission. Let me take a minute just to. This started about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. Many of us, actually with scientific background, have been very much concerned about the fundamental assumption in modern science that matter is the ultimate reality. That's the fundamental assumption starting from the 16th, 17th century. So initially, everything had to be expressed in terms of mass, length, and time. Those are the properties of matter. In the 19th century, because of electromagnetism, the word charge was also added to it, because charge could not be described in terms of mass, length, and time. So in the 20th century, because of quantum mechanics, another item called spin. I'm sure you don't want me to go into the details of all this, but just that was also added as a property. But ultimately, the basic idea is that everything comes from the fundamental reality, which is matter. So biology, through biophysics, wants to become a branch of physics. The whole program of physics to study matter in motion. Of course, the idea of matter changes, it gets connected with energy, with Einstein's theory of relativity. And the idea of motion gets changed because motion is basically space divided by time. That also gets challenged again by theories of relativity. So it is true that fundamental revolutions in physics since the 16th centuries have dealt with what is matter, what is motion, what is time, what is space, what is energy. But nevertheless, the basic idea remains that matter is the fundamental reality. So biology through biophysics wants to become branch of physics, chemistry through physical chemistry, and geology through geophysics. Similarly, even psychology through how various particles in the brain may be moving. Everybody wants to become a branch of physics, all scientific enterprise. This is absolutely the truth. And therefore, this question that is being brought here from the spiritual point of view is just the opposite. So Galileo Commission was actually started basically by about 40 or 50 people with scientific background. I happen to be one of them, questioning this fundamental assumption of modern science and trying to suggest that we need to, as it were, revisit the whole idea of science, where consciousness would be regarded as the primary reality. But all that is easier said than done because nothing gets easily changed. And partly because modern science, especially at the end of the 19th century in Germany, got intimately associated with technology. From then onwards, for example, just to remind you, during the development of the atom bomb, more people got Nobel Prizes in physics than at any other time. So technology and science have been very intimately connected, leading to more and more power. So every government has a department of science and technology. They don't have a department of music or department of poetry, but they'll have a department of science and technology. So in any case, so the Galileo Committee, partly to honor Galileo, who is regarded as the father of modern science, and so there in the foreword to that report of the Galileo Commission titled Science Beyond a Materialist Worldview, this is what he wrote in the introduction as follows. With the advent of the Maharishi, you remember Maharishi had brought meditation starting at, I think, 1960s? Yeah. Meditation and Eastern philosophy, it was becoming clear that the limitations of Western science and its insistence on a brain-based creation of consciousness were no longer tenable. And much to my surprise, then he says, by this time I had discovered the work of Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, and learned meditation in the tradition of the Shankaracharya, Swami Shantananda Saraswati in India. So all this very much changed his whole attitude. Then he continues, the introduction to the West of transcendental meditation by the Maharishi meant that there was now a pool of meditation subjects who could be investigated, and it soon became apparent that meditation could produce very wide mental states which had some reflection in charge of brain physiology, but was much wider than that. So many of these changes really began almost from 1960s onwards, and Raymond Moody came to that his book in 1980s, and more of this data has been collected since then. Then Ian Stevenson, he was a medical doctor, spent a lot of time trying to gather information about reincarnation. And when he died, which was in 2007, on the obituary, this was a remark. Either Dr. Stevenson is making a colossal mistake, or he will be known as the Galileo of the 20th century. And what he was doing, basically, collecting a lot of information about reincarnation. I actually was in a conference with him in Finland, and I asked him, how is it, first of all, by the way, he had trying to be very scientific, he had very dull titles for his books, such as 20 more cases of reincarnation. So next book will be 5 more cases of reincarnation. I said, why can you have some more striking titles than this? But he said, no, we have to put this in the scientific terminology. But then I asked him, how is it that most of the data that he's quoting is either from Asia or from Africa? Hardly any from Europe or from North America. He said, well, I'm not really sure, but my impression is that in Europe, if a kid at the age of 3 speaks in a language which is different from his parents' language, they think he's got some psychological problems. Or they don't listen to him. So then the kid stops speaking. Whereas in Asia, the tendency is, oh, well, he must be recalling a previous reincarnation or something like that. So they don't dismiss him, and so he can say more. That was his response, but whether it is actually true is hard to say. But in any case, here I give you another reference here if you wish to look at it. Useful information about scientific exploration of reincarnation is available at these places there. Here is the general summary. Reincarnation by the numbers. There is another doctor now, Tucker is his last name. This is actually from him. He's more or less carrying on what Ian Stevenson was doing earlier, who died in 2007, so that's not yesterday, that's already many years ago. So first of all, the median age of the time of the previous person's death is 28. Most children claiming memories of past life are between the age of 2 and 6. After 6, they're already now in school. You can imagine what goes on. New education, all how can I get ahead? How can I get a scholarship? How can I go to a better college? Competition, that is almost the basis of all education, including my own. And then 60% of the children who claim past life memories are male. Roughly 70% of the children claim they died a violent or unnatural death. 70% in those cases, just over of the deceased individuals, were male, the same ratio as in the general population. Then 90% of the children say they were the same sex in a previous life as they are now. The median time between claimed death and birth is 16 months. 20% of the children claim memories of the time between death and rebirth. The most ancient Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, says, whoever departs from this world without having realized their own inner world, to them life has been of no service. It remains unlived, like the unrecited Vedas or any other undone deed. I'm not going to say very much more about the scientific part of reincarnation, but just wanted to draw your attention to what is really the call from the spiritual side. That to see what is my inner world. This again has been said in many different ways by me. Every religion says in one way or the other that the death of the body is not the death of the person. So always the suggestion is that the body is obviously in the material world, obvious world, and whatever this other thing is which does not die when the body dies, that is the inner world. But am I paying any attention to that inner world? That's what the Upanishads are saying, that if I die without paying any attention to my inner world, then life has had no meaning. That's the purpose of the whole life from the perspective of the spiritual world, is why this spiritual element has taken on my body. And how do I correspond to it or respond to it? I had about an hour-long conversation with Krishnamurti, actually only about a year before he died, in 1985. In fact, the Krishnamurti Foundation here, sadly, it was just being recorded on a simple recorder, and he was already in 1985, as you know, he was 89 years old. So his voice was not so strong. Sadly, I am being heard quite clearly in that recording, but he's not being heard all that clearly. So the Krishnamurti Foundation here actually sent it to England, that recording, to see if they could fix it. They have improved it a little bit, so one can actually, you can watch it it's available on the internet. But this is a remark I asked him about death, what happens after death. He was not that young at that time, as I just said. Then his response is very interesting. This is actually central. I mean, it is of course being said by Krishnamurti, but any spiritual teacher would say exactly that. The real question is, can I die while I am living? Remember, I quoted to you from Christ, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. I had quoted to you from the various texts in the Indian tradition. You will be asked after death, who are you? If the answer is anything other than nobody, you may not enter the door of the sun. So this is absolutely the common idea, but Krishnamurti naturally puts it in his own language. So the real question is, can I die while I am living? Can I die to all my collections, material, psychological, religious? If you can die to all that, then you will find out what is there after death. Either there is nothing, absolutely nothing, or there is something. But you cannot find out until you actually die while living. The other day I had also quoted to you this great Sufi saying, if you die before you die, you not die when you die. Mm-hmm. It's also on the monastery on Mount Athos, actually. This is from the Gospel of Philip, non-canonical. Those who say that we first die and then are resurrected are wrong. Whoever is not resurrected before death knows nothing and will die. Christ's remark, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? By the way, there is sometimes a tendency in the Christian tradition, because he was crucified, therefore cross becomes the important symbol. It's the other way around. He was the son of a carpenter and was making crosses before there was any idea of arresting him or doing anything to him. So call to the cross is much before any notion of crucifixion. And cross is actually, you can find this even in the ancient Indian tradition, ancient Egyptian tradition. Always the suggestion is that it is the meeting point of the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, connecting with the verticality, which is to say with the divine presence, and connecting with the world. So cross is always meant to be the call for relating both upwards and at the same level where you are, taking care of the neighbors of the world. But in any case, because he was crucified, therefore cross becomes particularly important symbol in the name of it. But he was making crosses before he was crucified. The aim of any spiritual practice is not freedom for myself, but freedom from myself. This I have quoted earlier as well. Unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. And then from Shatapath Brahmana, very ancient text in India, before the Upanishads actually, only those may enter the sun door who can truly respond to the question, who are you? With nobody. Which is also the reason, I think more than once I have said here, clearly the call in any spiritual teaching is to try to practice something as it were to be on the way, but at the same time to be out of the way. This is the interesting call. To be on the way, but out of the way. Not me centered. That is really the call, again and again. Here is another remark of Krishnamurti. All human problems arise from this extraordinarily complex living center, which is the me. The self must cease through awareness of its own limitation, the falseness of its own existence. However deep, wide, and extensive it may become, the self is always limited. And until it is abandoned, the mind can never be free. The mere perception of that fact is the ending of the self, and only then is it possible for that which is the real to come into being. I often try to remind my Krishnamurti friends that absolutely everything he brought is extremely traditional. Very much really the spiritual teachings are bringing exactly that, but he's putting it in modern terminology and always insisting that he doesn't believe in any tradition or any teacher, etc. The Christ or the real self or the eternal particle of Krishna lives in me, but I am aware of it only when the usual ego is out of the way. For example, St. Paul said, I die daily. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. more than once I have tried to emphasize, because we can of course find all of these kinds of remarks in every spiritual teaching. But what is really significant is, how does it apply to me? Each one of us needs to consider this. How do I correspond or respond to these kinds of remarks? It's all very nice to say that one honors the Buddha or Christ or Krishna. What does it mean to honor them? Just to make pictures of them and put it on the wall? Is that what it means? Or how do I correspond to their teachings? As St. Paul said, I die daily. Just wanted to make a remark. Dying daily means freedom from self-will, freedom from self-importance, freedom from what I know, a willingness to be surprised. A mark of this inner reorientation in the aspirant is a shift from being in a state of occupation with acquisition and self-advancement to a state of love for others and of wishing to be of service. This is the real meaning of dying to self. A spiritual seeker wishes for a transformation of being that would radically alter the quality of the relationship with higher energies or subtler levels. This transformation results in a life that is not ego-centered, but is spirit-centered. And also again and again a reminder, more than once I have spoken about this here, it's easy to say God is omnipresent. But take it seriously. He's right here, in front of me, behind me, inside me. And the call in all spiritual teachings is not to be looking for God out there, out in heaven, but we'll look within. This is the remark of the Buddha. Look within, you are the Buddha. Read any of the sages in the Christian tradition or in the Jewish tradition or any of the tradition. Always the call is to search within. God is not in Mecca or in Varanasi or in Jerusalem. He's inside here. Now this I have quoted more than once, an old Sufi saying, if you die before you die, you will not die when you die. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that this is also written on a wall on the Mount, in the St. Paul Monastery on Mount Athos. I actually recommend for you to go there if you can. They don't allow any females to go there, sadly, but males can go there, which is really very peculiar. Now you see how it can become so strange symbol. Mother Mary, after the death of Christ, her ship ended up somehow near that island near Greece. So then that became the place where Eastern Orthodox monasteries are on that island. Even the Greeks need actually a visa to go to Mount Athos, although it's part of Greece territory, but even they need a visa to go there. And when I asked for a visa, they asked me, what is your profession? I said, well, I was a professor of religion. Oh, of course, you can go. They were very happy for me to go. So I had no trouble getting a visa. But the reason I'm mentioning it, sadly, because Mother Mary was said to be virgin, and it's all taken so literal-mindedly. So no females are allowed there, only the...
Even if they're virgins? Even if they are virgins?
Yeah. Actually, even female animals are not allowed. Can you believe this? It's absolutely amazing to me. Yeah, but part of the reason I'm saying this, how anything can become so stupidly centered on an idea or a phrase or a word, but there it is.
Ravi, I did hear of a place in India, unfortunately I can't remember, but they don't allow females into it. It's a holy site.
Some
But-
temple.
Yeah, some
Yeah.
temple, yeah. But it was mostly because of the energies of a female when they're on their cycle, and it could be damaging. Like, I don't know, I mean,
I know.
do you know of any of these places?
Actually, what is behind is that they are supposed to not go there during their menstrual period.
Yeah,
But since nobody can be very clear who has a menstrual period at one time, so they ban all the females from coming there. This has been now questioned, very much challenged actually.
good. Good to challenge.
But again and again I remind people, dying to the self or freedom from the self or leaving the self behind does not mean to be against the self or killing the self. The ego self is meant to be an instrument of the highest self. Again, I repeat something I have said more than once. From the perspective of the spiritual teachings, this element of the spirit that has taken on my body, so that this body can undertake the appropriate actions to assist its evolution. So why be against the instrument which is supposed to take the actions? There is no reason to be against the body or the mind. But the question is it really just self-occupied? By which I mean just the bodily desires and fears? Is that all it is occupied with? Or is it actually able to serve something? Which is why again and again I have been quoting to you this remark of my teacher Jean de Salzman: ego is a good servant but a bad master. Who wants the servant who just wants to lie around doing nothing? But if the servant wants to make all the decisions in the household, that's where the problem comes. I even, maybe Maria should respond to this, if I had not written some books which requires my ego, would you invite me to talk here? So why be against the ego? I keep reminding people again and again, ego is required to undertake any damn action in the world.
You wrote those just to be of service to us. You wrote them just to be of service to us.
Ravi, I had an experience where I was shown the ego is actually very divine, and it's doing its divine work by protecting us. And ultimately, it really wants to surrender to the divine.
Yeah.
But we are here, it's doing its work to protect us. So when we work it out, when we don't need the protection, the ego is happy to surrender to the divine,
Yeah.
because it is divine.
Yes. Now you see what had actually happened, that began more or less in the beginning of the 20th century, starting with Freud and even a little bit with Carl Jung. Ego got more or less attached with the most negative part of it, selfishness. Otherwise the word ego, its origin is from Latin and Greek. Ego simply means self. For example, all the famous remarks of Christ, I am the way, the truth and the life, they begin with the word ego eimi. Ego simply means self. But it has become associated with complete selfishness. But it can also be selfless. So what you're pointing out is ego is really just the instrument. It can be completely down or it can take you completely up. So whatever we mean by capital S self and small s self, it's really the small s self has to do all the actions so that it can gradually bring you closer and closer to the capital S self. So ego is really the small s self. There is no, but it has become since the 20th century beginning associated in literature almost wholly with the negative side, selfish side. It's partly how the language shifts a little bit and then one gets too occupied with something or the other. Here, her reminder to me again, you don't love yourself enough. The self that wishes and needs to emerge. The important thing is to be. If there is no real self, then the ego takes over. Energy cannot be without relationship. If it does not serve the self intentionally, then it automatically serves the ego. But until there is the self, let the ego be. It can be useful. What else are you going to do? Ego is a good servant, but a bad master. This is from Heart Without Measure, actually. Some of you may have read this. In fact, the part I don't have it, quotation here, let me just mention this to you. On one occasion, I was very struck by my own vanity. You have to take my word for it. I used to be even more vain than I am now. Take my word for it. But on the other hand, I also realized that it is just a waste of energy, that I gain absolutely nothing from this. So I asked my teacher, how can I be free of vanity? And I was completely surprised by her response. She said, if you did not have vanity, what will you do? Everything you do, everything that most human beings do, starts from their vanity. Trying to acquire something, to achieve something, to become known, etc. So she says there is no reason to be against vanity. But this is where she then has this remark that ego is a good servant but a bad master. Then always this suggestion, as I quoted earlier from the Maha-Upanishad, the world within, unless you correspond to this, your life is wasted. But ironically, the mind can never really figure it out. But to remain connected with those subtle energies changes one's life. Rabindranath Tagore, hardly a negligible poet, 3 countries have their national anthems based after his poetry. And this is the last poem he wrote, just 13 days before he died, in Bengali. That was his mother tongue. But I translate this into English. In the beginning of my life, with the first rays of the rising sun, I asked, who am I? Now at the end of my life, with the last rays of the setting sun, I ask, who am I? So in a way, the inquiry is never solved, but it carries an enormous amount of energy and affects one's whole life, certainly his whole life. He was a remarkable poet, musician, singer. In fact, towards the end of his life, after having many communications with Einstein, he started learning physics, much to my surprise. But a very remarkable poet. And so, in a way, it's not a question that one can answer the question, who am I? But to come back to this again and again energizes one's life and activity. I suggest these things just simply if you wish to try them, because after today, the next 4 occasions I'll be speaking about love. So far, the 4 occasions, including today, I've been speaking about death. So write in your own journal about what do I wish should happen to me when I die. If I am reincarnated as a human being, do I wish to be born as a male or a female? Why? That would show your own experience of being a male or a female and your attitude to this. It will be helpful to discuss this. This is the Indian version of my book, The Spiritual Roots of Yoga. Okay, is there any particular slide anybody wishes to see again before we stop?
Robbie, it was the first time I saw the word mind mentioned as opposed to keep.
First time?
But I heard mind mentioned instead of brain. And I can't remember what slide it was, but I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the difference of perception between the brain and the mind.
Well, that's actually in the Galileo Commission, maybe there. The suggestion is traditionally from the allopathic medical point of view, mind and brain cannot be separated. But in the near-death experiences, the experience is that whatever we associate with the mind, awareness, consciousness, being able to say something, obviously the brain is dead. But mind still seems to be functioning. So otherwise the idea that mind requires the whole matter basis of brain. So actually currently in the philosophical circles, there is much debate about the distinction between mind and brain. Can they be separated? Or philosophers will keep arguing. This is their job. And they publish papers on it, and those who publish more will get a prize, etc. So that's what they have to do. But they don't directly perceive anything. Philosophers, the whole project of philosophy is to win an argument. Which is why Aldous Huxley wrote this famous book called The Perennial Philosophy. He hardly quotes any philosophers in that book. He mostly quotes people who actually directly perceived something or directly experienced something. So coming back to your question, mind and brain, can they be separated, is very much the idea behind the Galileo Commission saying, yes, they can be separated. Consciousness can exist without the brain, but from a traditional scientific perspective, it cannot exist without the brain. Anybody else?
Well, is reincarnation just limited to Earth? Because I want to go to another galaxy where the species is more evolved. So why do we have to limit ourselves to man or woman or animal? What about other galaxies and universes where there's a higher state of existence?
Maybe I didn't emphasize that part here. The suggestion in the Upanishads are, there are two different doors. One is called the door of the moon, the other is the door of the sun. Those who are enlightened or advanced spiritually, they come to the door of the sun. And if they can then enter, where the question is asked, who are you? And the answer, only the appropriate, acceptable answer is, I am you. So that oneness, then they are allowed to enter the sun door. I didn't go into the details of this. I had quickly shown that on one occasion.
Then we're not coming back to Earth.
Then you're not coming back to Earth, you go to another realm.
I just have to remember that when I die.
Yes, but when you come to the door of the moon, the way it is expressed, that the moon basically swallows people up and then puts them down as rain, as reincarnation. So those who are not enlightened or advanced, they go to the door of the moon rather than the door of the sun. That's the distinction.
Then they become a human again.
Not necessarily human.
Or an animal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see.
Cockroaches.
Earthly.
Depending on what they have done. Okay, we'll stop and come back again. But I'm always very interested in people's questions, and you don't have to agree with everything I'm saying. I'm trying to learn myself.
I have a little bit of a trouble with assuming that some of these near-life experiences are what will happen after death. It seems to me that a lot of the study right now about near-death experiences are really, really important, because it expands an understanding of what happens during life. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to make the leap that these near-death experiences, I think they may may be experienced when people are in a heightened state of openness. But to sort of assume that these people were actually dead, maybe dying, maybe over, some people have died physically for many, many minutes and then lived again. But I can't quite, just rationally, make that leap. But I think it's very important work, and I think it's very important work looking at dying and opening more and acknowledging greater and greater experiences of the...
No, I suspect probably most of us here would share with you the kind of fear or hesitation but again, I don't know what I could actually, I have personally not had that experience myself, but the overall suggestion, perhaps more emphasized in the Tibetan Book of the Dead or even by Annie Besant in her book, that after death one would look at one's whole life. So we have to be prepared for that, and then one can, not one can, but one naturally makes a corresponding judgment. It's not a question of that I have a decision about it. If my life has been just full of completely self-centered totally, then my next birth will be corresponding to that somehow or the other. But if my life, when I look at it, that there have been some occasions when I was actually generous or had enough humility to receive something, then I'm likely to be born in a different place or a different way. But this is not a question of, it's really more like a law. It's not a matter of a choice that I'm making. It's like it's just like if the water is boiled up to a certain temperature, it becomes steam. It's not a question of decision being made by the water. It's a law. So that one is afraid of that, maybe partly arising because when I look back in my own life, I could hardly label some incidents that I could honestly say were totally free of me. So it's likely that I'll be put into some cage after in the next life or in some lower level. But if that's the law, what's the choice? This is really how, in a certain way, sadly, religions actually exploit simple-minded people who don't know directly. So they simply say, well, if you give more money to the church, then you are guaranteedly going to go to heaven, that kind of thing. So that whole business of emphasizing reward and punishment and then making some deal about it, which is really what, in fact, just some of you probably know that the main emphasis why Martin Luther broke away from the church, because of precisely at that time there was much emphasis on trying to contribute more and more to the church, etc. And Martin, as you know, there have been two items, I'm sure everybody here knows all this, that either it is a matter of effort from our side or a matter of grace from the other side. And Martin Luther very strongly believed in that it is wholly a matter of grace. It doesn't matter what you do. That the Holy Spirit cannot be forced by my action. In fact, most of my Lutheran friends never seem to quote this. This is a remark of Martin Luther, not my remark. Therefore, sin bravely. This is his remark. Partly because he has just married a nun called Kate. So he was willing to sin bravely because nothing can force the Holy Spirit from his point of view. Doesn't matter what you do. The Holy Spirit has to make its own decision. And so very much effort on simply grace. Ironically, later on in the Protestant tradition, generally, much more effort, which is completely, generally, if you look at sociological data, Catholics and Protestants are always working much harder trying to achieve something or the other, which is completely contrary to what Luther was saying in a way. So this notion of that, but generally speaking, in most spiritual traditions, there is a subtle combination that everything depends on. This is actually from one of the Upanishads, this remark, that all human realizations depend on a combination of human effort and benediction of the devas. Something is required from our side, but it is also true that there are large forces running the universe. Remember, there are 2 trillion galaxies. We are hardly, I keep reminding myself, even when this so-called Ravi is dead, the galaxies will still be turning. Nothing is stopping them. So there is no reason to fantasize about one's importance in the universe. On the other hand, about oneself, there is always a suggestion that something is required from our side, but also there are great laws corresponding to which I will be wherever I deserve to be in the next life. Yes?
Ravi, this quote from the most ancient Upanishad that says, whoever departs from this world without having realized their own inner world, to them life has been of no service, it remains unlived. But then you're saying that when we come upon our death and are asked who are we, if we say nobody, we get to go to the sun and to the upper realms, other planets perhaps. And if we talk about perhaps the inner worlds that we've cultivated and the services that we've shared, we have to go to the moon and back down. My question is, are we able to cultivate all this inner world and this inner nourishing spiritual life and be of service and not have attachment to it, but to be able to talk about it in a way that releases it or celebrates it? It's like,
Well,
rather than saying I'm nobody.
when we speak about inner world, maybe to use a slightly different phrase, what is the purpose of my life?
Are we able,
What do I understand to be the purpose of my life? And then am I corresponding to it? Am I actually undertaking whatever is required for me to undertake this? And then the suggestion is that if I am actually corresponding to it, then I'm living my life rightly. Otherwise I'm just wasting my life, as this remark from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad actually says. So, what is the purpose of one's life is not so easy to determine, but one gradually can come to some understanding of it, because certain things that one does give, if you like, what we sometimes call an inner satisfaction. All these words can have dualistic meaning. It could also seem, oh, I'm feeling more important, I'm more honored, I have more prestige. That can be one kind of inner satisfaction. But it can also be that it's not a question of how important I feel I am, but that I am in fact serving something that corresponds to my life's mission. So this kind of remark from the Upanishad is really a reminder again and again to pay attention to your inner world, much more than external world. This is really all spiritual teaching anything that I have understood anywhere is always dealing with your inner life. So always a call to look inside. What is it that you wish? What stands in your way? What do you think will help, etc. So it's always to do with the inner vision again and again, which is why also strong emphasis on impartial self-inquiry. But the moment something gets organized, for example, sadly, you can look at the whole canonical Bible, including these, what they call Old Testament, New Testament. There is not a single entry under self-study or self-knowledge or self-inquiry, whatever words. But the moment you look at non-canonical Gospels, for example, here I quote to you from memory from Gospel of Thomas, which is non-canonical. Kingdom of God is within you and without you, meaning outside you, but they use the expression without you. If you would know God, you must know yourself. Then you will be known. And then you will realize that you are the child of the living Father. If you do not know yourself, you are in poverty. In fact, you are poverty. I personally don't know a stronger statement emphasizing self-study. So, but the tragedy is the moment things get organized, it's appealing to the mass appeal. Who in the church has ever said to anybody, just look within, what are you searching for, etc. It always gets a different occupation. Same thing is what I just, these remarks are not only about Christianity, it's exactly the same what goes on in Hinduism, Buddhism, everywhere else. The trouble is, religions always of necessity end up appealing to the masses, not to searchers. And anybody who is at all a searcher sooner or later feels a little uneasy about this, but some of them end up leaving the church. And I keep reminding people again and again, Christ was not following what the churches or the synagogues were saying at that time. The Buddha was not following what the temples were telling him at that time. And in modern times, Raman Maharishi wasn't doing this, Krishnamurti wasn't doing this, Gurdjieff wasn't doing it. Gurdjieff actually even makes this remark, if you want to lose your faith, make friends with a priest. This is one of his remarks. So the reason I'm saying this, that none of the sages that you can actually look at were just following what was being said in the churches or the temples. That doesn't mean that one needs to be against them. They have some function as well. For example, without the churches, let us say in Europe, you won't have great cathedrals, you won't have the frescoes, you won't have much music preserved. So there is no reason to be against any of this. But important to realize that spiritual search is not being emphasized in the churches. That's not the project of the church. Believing something, having faith in something, that becomes the project. And then occasionally somebody responds or reacts against it, then they may stay within the churchly organization or they may be expelled or excommunicated. Both can happen. Yeah. But organized religions have done more harm to spiritual search than any other institution. Search is not what is recommended in any organized religion.
In the theosophical tradition, there's a strong emphasis on the fact that once we have gained admission to the human kingdom by our own efforts, there is no moving back into a lower form of life, a lower form of consciousness. And the emphasis on the spiritual search is strong, and it's because the potential for us once we have become human is almost unlimited. And we have a responsibility then to really become more aware of who we are physically, within and without, and that that's really the only hope for us now. The idea of moving back into a lower kingdom seems to me almost to be a kind of fear energy. Whereas the idea that once we're here, we have this path before us that is demanding and rigorous and requires just an enormous faith in the spirit of what it means to be human. So, and also the idea that when one reaches the sun door, in how many millions of years, one can turn back and come back of our own volition to assist those who are still moving back and forth between the entrance and to the moon. So all of those things seem really important for me to emphasize now.
Yes. No, I think my impression is that in fact people from any spiritual tradition, and I'm now including theosophical ideas as a part of his spiritual teaching, they would more or less probably emphasize the same thing. The question is how many people in fact end up really following it. You know, this is always the difficulty. Now, it's not a question of taking it personally, but really how many theosophists actually have come to the level of Annie Besant or to the level of Madame Blavatsky. Now, so there is a large range, but there can be a call, and some people can try to seriously follow it, some have difficulty. But similarly, of course, you can find this in the Christian tradition, even though I keep saying the organized religion may not do so, but anybody who reads anything written by Meister Eckhart or John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, or if you read anything in the Theologia Germanica or in the Philokalia, I'm giving you some standard text from the Christian tradition. Very much a call. But then there are 3 billion Christians now on the planet. How many of them are actually following that call? Same question one needs to raise about one's own organization, but that doesn't mean that one needs to dismiss the organization or to diminish the call. That is really very much the call, to rise above the usual level of being rather than to go back or go down. In fact, then, especially if you look at any notion dealing with reincarnation in the theosophical literature, they almost never speak about that one may be born at a lower level. They're always going to be at a higher level. There is almost the assumption or a presumption that in the next life I will be at a slightly higher level. Whereas generally in the overall Indian tradition, one could be at a higher level as well as at a lower level, as I quoted from the Upanishads, that depending on what one has done. So the assumption is, as I said, in the theosophical literature, that anybody following it would naturally rise above rather than go down. Why should one be against that? I think it's a nice positive call. Yes.
If one were able to reach that point where one would respond to nothing, it seems like what would remain would be, if nothing else, the perceiver. And who is the perceiver?
Well, again, one can take any of these expressions very literal-mindedly. Nobody is denying that the perceiver has to disappear. After all, even somebody like, say, Christ, if he is going to construct a sentence, he needs to know subject, object, predicate. So nobody is against him dealing with the usual understanding of the language, etc. So when it is said nothing, or if one is asked, who are you, and nobody, is really freedom from my personal achievement, my personal advancement. That doesn't mean that this instrument is dead. This instrument has its own abilities and research. So one doesn't need to take these things so literal-mindedly to say nobody doesn't mean that I am completely extinguished. Even, as I said, even the Buddha or Christ could not use a sentence without knowing something in the language. So freedom from oneself is not killing oneself, it's just not being attached to it, not being driven by it. I repeatedly...
What is it that remains?
Pardon?
What is it that remains? What is it that perceives? Or is that just the same question as who am I?
I don't know whether I could personally, from my own experience, explain this, because am I really free of me, me, me? I'm not sure that that can possibly be true in my case. So I don't know what remains. But I guess I was just saying generally, certainly the ordinary human being remains. There is, being free of oneself doesn't mean that I don't any longer need to eat something, or I don't need to go for a walk, or I don't need to do exercises. Nobody is suggesting any of that. Ordinary body, ordinary mind obviously remains and has to be well preserved. In fact, very strong emphasis, especially in the Yoga Sutras more than anywhere else. Why emphasis on certain kind of physical practices, physical postures? That the body needs to be kept in good shape. Mind needs to be in good shape, because this is meant to be the instrument to assist all this. But not to get into such absolutely fantastic bodily postures that I show off. I can stand on one leg for 35 minutes. That kind of thing. As I think I mentioned the other day, if you look at externally, this is nothing to do with the yoga especially, but people who win great races, hardly any of them lives more than the age of 60. In a certain way, they damage their body by this extra emphasis. So I think from a spiritual point of view, the body needs to be taken care of, the mind needs to be taken care of, but not to be so attached to it that I'm wholly occupied with my bodily needs and desires. So when you say what remains, I imagine the body remains, the mind remains. One can still use the language. And
Ravi, could you speak about the second body?
well, that is, different expressions get used. Second body or subtler body, sthul sharir, suksham sharir. There are many different expressions. No, but the suggestion, my impression is this. One mode of speaking is different levels of energy, and that then energy coming down gets subjected to more and more laws. But the same kind of idea is sometimes expressed in different levels of the body. That subtler body is subject to fewer laws than the gross body. And if you like, the subtlest body, which is hardest to describe, is not subject to any laws. It does not die, it is not, as Krishna said in the Bhagavad Gita, it cannot be made wet, it cannot be burned, it cannot be dried, or etc., etc. So my own personal impression is that either one moves in terms of different qualities of energy or different qualities of body, depending on what will be a usable expression, depending. So subtler body is always in the spiritual practice, this is the other thing, to be free of more and more laws governing the whole of humanity. For example, I gave a very simple example the other day. If somebody is mean to me in the morning, I don't want to sit next to them at lunch. Now, it's a law of reaction, and I'm subject to it. But I have an impression that a relatively wiser person could be somewhat free of it. And then whatever we mean by occult knowledge essentially means freedom from usual laws of knowledge. Somebody like Leadbeater could look at a 9-year-old kid on the beach and see something quite exceptional about this kid. Others didn't see that something exceptional about this kid. Similarly, it is also said, I actually don't know any details about it, but that Leadbeater was aware of the ship Titanic actually sinking before it was even reported. So he must have occult knowledge. What does occult knowledge mean? Basically not subject to the usual laws. In fact, ironically, my impression is that spiritual development is to become more and more lawless. In fact, a remark of St. Paul that I have quoted more than once here, he who is connected with the Spirit is above the law. This was actually one of the major shifts. If you look at the general emphasis, looking at it from the outside, not either as a Christian or as a Jew, but the general emphasis in the Old Testament, or what Christians call the Old Testament, is actually on law. Shift in the New Testament is towards love. Very noticeable shift if you read almost any text in the what is called the Old Testament. Very much emphasis on law, and therefore undertaking the appropriate practices with appropriate consequences, etc. Whereas love often gets associated with grace, and then of course that can be misused. If I believe in Christ, I am saved. You see, anything can be misused, any idea can be misused, but the notion nevertheless is more and more emphasis on love. Just shift, if you just read the text, especially for somebody like me coming from outside both these traditions, when I read it, that was very striking to me. Shift from emphasis on law to emphasis on love. Every remark of Christ somehow has the word love in it, which is quite surprising actually. I don't know any other religious literature which has that kind of emphasis. Other words get used. For example, usually there is a tendency to say Buddha the compassionate, Christ the loving, Allah the merciful. But these words have many things in common, compassion, mercy, love. But somehow once these phrases get used by somebody, then one gets very attached to those expressions. That's one of the difficulties. I would be surprised if any of you have ever read anywhere saying Buddha the loving. It will be always Buddha the compassionate. Yes, Rick?
I wanted to make a comment about works and grace, but I want to put it into a context because I've been thinking on and off recently about Nicholas de Cusa and his identity of opposites.
Yes.
Which, the simple example of that is the idea of, is it concave or is it convex? It depends on your point of view.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that that both grace and works are actually the same. It just depends on who is doing them or what entity is doing them.
Say a little bit more about it.
Pardon me?
Say a little bit more about it.
Well, I think it's related to the fact that there are no others. And so one does a work, for instance, gives to charity, it's received as a grace by the person who receives it. So, is it works? Is it grace? It depends on which way you're looking at it.
Yes, but on the other hand, in the general spiritual teachings, always, first of all, a suggestion of a kind of a hierarchy of levels. And there the notion really would be not the being judged by the receiver of the charity or the giver of charity, but being judged by a completely impartial look coming from above both of them. So there, I think it's a slightly different emphasis than in the example that you gave, where, of course, the receiver of charity would naturally be very grateful and would regard this as a grace, and the giver of charity might even think, this is my effort, maybe I should therefore get a reward for it. But from a spiritual point of view, it's not a question of the judgment either by the giver or by the receiver. It's really, whenever they speak about an impartial look, it's, if you like, it's being looked by God, or by, we might say, by Saint Peter, but that's just a way of speaking, or impartially something in me who can momentarily actually look from a very high level. So it can be even within the charity giver or the charity receiver.
Well, perhaps I put it in a context which is more earthly than it needs to be. So if you have, some kind of supernatural grace, presumably there's a St. Peter or a judgment involved in the appropriateness of that action, but it is a work done by that entity, whoever that is.
Yeah, but in any case, what do we gain from this? From this particular suggestion that you're making? How does it help either our work?
One of the things that one gains is that it throws the whole question of works or grace into a certain context, that they're not really very different. It's just which end of the stick one is speaking about, so to speak.
No, I think that is actually a helpful general suggestion, that the same thing or same action on my part can be coming from selfishness or from selfless part of me. Can be a matter of grace or can be a matter of my acquisition. I think that is, so therefore it is not to get so attached to the particular action, but maybe the attitude behind it or the doer behind it will be more helpful. Yes?
Just like to comment, that was one of the best layman explanations of particle and waves I've ever heard in quantum, right?
Yes.
What are you seeing, a particle or a wave?
Depends on the context, right? Frame of reference. Yes. No, but again, I personally feel more and more can my questions, my inquiries, my readings, my practices move towards more and more freedom from me, or just because it will be good for me to win an argument or to bring a perspective that will be considered great. So I think it's a question really what is helpful for us in the perspective of whatever we understand by a spiritual practice. Yes, do you want to say?
I was just going to say, what feels like one of the major doorways through not being a part of these religions or these belief systems or these societies is to really trust that intimacy with your own felt knowing and allow that to guide you and to teach you and to inform you, because what that ultimately is going to do in my own experiences, it opens you up to your deeper purpose. It's only helping one connect with something authentic within them, and what's authentic within them is our God self. And so that moves us toward purpose. That moves us toward unity. That moves us out of the ego in its protective ways into a surrendered state that allows this bigger potential of who we are. And it also allows us to leave the self behind. And it also allows us for the eternal to meet the linear. Because as you move into purpose, you move into unity, you move into your eternal state, and then you get to come back and interact with the linear, which you always talk about, where the eternal can meet the linear. So then they all sort of converge as we listen to this deeper knowing and trust and follow and let it unfold, which is the subtler energies. And then they become stronger because we've created a larger doorway for them. And then they start to inform us of what our true purpose is. And our true purpose has more aliveness and more joy and more peace and more passion than anything that we can do at a self-acquisition level. So by its very nature, it propels us into this level of service, purpose, unity, eternal, God self, authenticity, passion, genius that we are. So it's all converging into that place of being on planet Earth from this larger place, and there is no going back. Why would you go back? And then the ego gets to rest. It gets to sit in its own divine nature and inform you in another level. So they're all converging. Everything that you've taught me is converging as we move toward this place of purpose and unity through listening to this deeper knowing and following it regardless of what the world says. But anyway, I just thought I would share that.
Karen, you wanted to say something?
Well, this is a very practical question, especially after you, David, because that was very beautiful. My question is, like, how can anyone in like war-torn places reach or even seek a spiritual aspect of the body or the mind? I mean, not even war-torn places, just people who are living out of trauma, out of for survival. Like it seems very hierarchical. The very fact that we're here, it just feels like a real privilege to be doing this search, to be doing, great works of service. But it feels like it's for the chosen few. And, what about all these beautiful lives that are born into war-torn or, being killed as we speak?
No, I actually agree with the question. Not a question you're raising, you're an observation you're making. 8 billion people on the planet. I would be very surprised if even 1% have the privilege of really searching for anything, whatever we may call spiritual. And at least half of this 8 billion are not even having enough food to eat, etc. And many of them are in war-torn areas, as you were just pointing out. So I don't know how one can dismiss all this, but the only thing that strikes me, if any one of us has enough to eat, enough time, enough wish to search for something real, we are fortunate, and that we should actually try this. Rather than worrying about that the other 8 billion can't do it. Almost guaranteedly at least 7.9 billion are not going to be able to do it or are willing to do it. So that's always going to be the case. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, we could say that the overall system is very bad, okay, but if we are privileged enough to have some freedom or some time, so at least to take that responsibility.
I did want to point out, Ravi, that the beautiful slides that you shared with quotes from the Bible or the Upanishads or whatever, they're so stunning and they're almost overwhelming. Thank you.
No, I think this is the reason why we even quote from these great texts, because they remind us of something or call us again to relate with those things. But one can also quote and not listen to them or not correspond to them. Mary, you were going to say, Maria.
My thought was related to what was brought up about the opposites and how they cohere. And there are a number of different examples, lover and beloved, but another is teacher and student. How we appear to be separate, but there can be no teacher without student, and no student without teacher. And the relationship we have, even with you, for example, and with each other when we help each other out, means that when we're working from a space of more than the little me, we bring everything we are, but we try to be together. All of those differences both energize us and hold us together in a deeper way. So the opposites always play off of each other. There can be no lover without the beloved. And when we think about helping others, no matter whether they're in a war-torn situation or not, can we give in a way that doesn't imply that the other is a victim? Can we somehow ennoble the giving and bring out the best in another and realize how much we're being taught in the process? So somehow we learn to live within these polarities and at the same time, as you said, learn to, in a way, transcend them. We don't even need to use the word grace, but that transcendence brings about some kind of a unity that is growing and growing and growing. So anyway, I'm hopeful.
You wish to say something? And we should make that as the last remark because already quite a ways past. Yes, please.
Yes, I just wanted to say the thought is a little linear to think that in these places there aren't great spiritual seekers amongst people in war-torn environments or in these places. There, of course, are everywhere. And it is quite privileged to be able to ruminate on these things. But having been in some of these environments, that's not to say that the needs of the body have to be met. So of course, in places of food scarcity and insecurity, you're thinking about how children are being affected and how civilians are being affected. But I've noticed the great sense of humor in the darkness that many people have gone through. I've also noticed the light bringers and the bodhicittas that are always there to help people. And we have to remember that you can incarnate into a soul that undergoes great adversity. And sometimes very, very high souls choose bodies that are mentally or physically disabled or on a path for evolving, that to choose that birth in order to overcome the judgments around it and to transcend the body. So I think all over the world there are great spiritual seekers that are leading the charge and are interested in truth and love and service, and they're what keep the spirits of those around them alive, and interested in the truth and in God, actually.
Thank you for a good reminder. Tomorrow I'll be more focusing on the love in the great tradition. So far I've been focusing on death and the attitudes to death. Okay, thank you very much.